Hey everyone, this is Mathmetrics. I'm going to be talking about two different products in this video. One of them is called Psyscope Pro by FX23, and I'm also going to be talking about a ducking tool that I love called Duck by Devious Machines. And I just want to make really clear before I start that I paid for both of these. This is not promotional in any way. I did not get NFRs. I don't have any sort of agreement with these companies. I just love them to death, and I feel that they're indispensable tools for electronic music production. And the new Psyscope Pro is just so freaking amazing. I had to show it to you. So that's what this video is about. Enjoy. Hey everyone, this is Mathmetrics, and I'm just showing you why oscilloscopes can be incredibly useful, and especially why Psyscope Pro, which is available on Windows only, not on Mac. But if you have Windows, this is an amazing oscilloscope, and it will save you so much time and help you get much better control over your dynamic range and the way things work together. It's great for aligning the phase on your kick and sub too, if you need to do that. So let me demo what we've got going on here. I have an instance of Psyscope Pro on my listen bus, which is just, post main, post mix bus. And then I have an instance of it here on my subs bus. And then I have two instances on my kick and snare bus. I do a lot of busing. I have a lot of different drum sounds that are all feeding into these drum buses. These sum into my drums bus right here. And then my drums bus subs with a bunch of other stuff to head up to main. So the nice thing about Psyscope is you don't have to deal with side chaining or anything. You just put an instance on every track you want to track with it, and you can have up to 8 instances of Psyscope. And then you can double click any one of these or look at any one of them, and they'll show you all of the instruments that you've defined. Here's the one that's on my listen bus. Here's the one on my snare. Here's the one on my sub. Here's the one on my kick, and so on. And then there's 4 more slots I haven't used yet. So the really cool thing about Psyscope is that it's always locked to your tempo. It doesn't drift around like so many other oscilloscopes do. And it also freezes everything when you stop playback. So you can see I've got a frozen playback of my kick and snare right now. And you can zoom in the sync window to as fast as 1/16th note, or as far out as 2 bars. Right now I'm looking at a bar. So this is kick, snare, kick, snare. It's just a common time beat right now. And what's cool, let's go back to a bar. What's cool is by default, the 0 crossings are right at the top and bottom edge of the window, but you can use this little slider to zoom in a little bit and see overshoots above your, I'm sorry, not 0 crossings, 0 dB full scale are these white lines. So you can zoom in really close, zoom out really far, and just totally tell when you have serious overshoots that you might need to take care of in some manual type of way. So right now you can see the kick is just a tiny bit under the 0 line. The snare is right up at the 0 line. And let's add in the sub and see what happens. Right now, I'm not doing any ducking on the sub. The 2 duckers on my sub bus are temporarily disabled to show you one type of problem that oscilloscopes are really good for. So I've got a kick and a snare, and just to kind of show you what's going on with the sub here, I've just got a series of sub notes, quarter notes, stopping a little short of each bar and hitting exactly on the beat. And this is just a little pattern I use for testing and aligning my sub to my kick. And I'll activate that in a minute. So here's the kick and the snare. You can always clear the display by clicking this button. So if we start playback, right, nothing fancy. And see, I stop playback, but they stay put. You can also scroll wheel in to zoom in and, really see what's going on. You can grab anywhere on the waveform and just drag back and forth to adjust things. And so, you know, these black lines are the beats. Okay, it's very tight to the grid. So you can see the kick is right on the grid. Normally I wouldn't do that, but in this case, it's right on the grid for testing. Snare is just basically like 1 or 2 samples off the grid. And that's what that looks like. So let's bring in the sub now. Let's click this and start playback. Whoops, let's activate my sub track. And let's, just to not confuse you too much, let's also right-click to turn off the snare, right-click to turn off the kick. Okay, so that's what the sub by itself looks like. And this isn't interacting with the kick or the snare in the scope. This is all prior to the point where they're summing. This is just showing me that sub instance sitting right on the sub bus. And you can see that it's starting to attenuate a little bit where the note is ending before each new beat. Okay, so here's what commonly happens. One problem that commonly happens is, you toss a sub on with your kick and your snare. Let's turn those on again. And then you get this sort of interaction. Let's see, what am I doing? Layers. Okay, so far that looks good, right? We have the kicks, we have the snare, we have the sub, everything looks fine. But again, in this view, I'm looking at each one of those oscilloscopes individually, and they're overlaid, right? And we can zoom in really close, and it looks like everything's fine, right? Except those of you in the know will take one look at this waveform here and realize that's going to create all kinds of trouble because the kick and the sub are out of phase here in the first section. And if we scroll over, it isn't until we get it towards the very tail end of the kick that they're kind of in phase again. And this is a really common problem with kicks and subs. The subs are usually very precise. Kicks have a lot of pitch drift, and so it's very common to have, your frequency slowing down on the kick as it goes through its pitch drop phase. And it isn't until the very tail part of the purple kick right here that you're at a constant body tone. Okay, so you usually can't ever get this part in phase, and you usually want to side chain out the sub over this part, and you only want to let the sub come back and start summing together with the kick in the section that you can get lined up in phase. Okay, so this is phase aligned if I were to turn the ducker on. But right now I've got the ducker off, so the entire kick waveform is interacting with the entire sub waveform. And what you get when that happens is something like this. Okay, so this is the sum of those 3 layers, and this is one of the things that's just awesome about Psyscope, is it's got a way you can look at things layered together, stacked one on top of the other. So I'm in here looking close at the kick, but if I zoom out a little bit, you'll see here's the snare up on this lane. But the layered view is really useful. And the sum, which basically says, let's see what all those layers do when they interact together. Boom. Now we start seeing problems, right? If I play this, you're going to hear it. So this is a kick, this is a snare, and you hear how every time the kick hits, the sub has this noticeable swell up. There's this gap in the sub, and you hear a swell up afterwards. Listen for it. You're not going to hear it on the snare so much because this waveform looks pretty good, but the kick is messed up, and it's shown by this big, huge gap right here. You're going to hear this gap. See, here are the sub sounds boingy. It's like boing, gung, boing, gung, boing, gung, right? That's what happens when you have phase interference between your kick and your sub. You notice here at the tail end of the kick and the sub interaction, and let's go back to layers again, and let's add this one in here. So now I'm looking at the main bus too, and you can kind of see behind everything. Here's the dip, the big dip. If I zoom in a little closer, you'll see this black waveform. There's the dip, boing, boing, and then here it comes back to a nice even tone. So this is because of this phasing right here. These are basically canceling each other out quite a bit. Okay, so if I come back here and we go to let's turn on the two duckers. So we're going to turn on the kick ducker, we're going to turn on the snare ducker, and now watch what happens with these waveforms. And you don't hear that boing anymore. So again, let's scroll all the way out. There's no boing. There's no drop in the sub energy. And if we look at just the total sum, and we zoom out a little further, you can see the waveform looks a lot more even. You have your transient peak for the kick. It's blending with the sub into a nice mellow sub. Then the snare hits and it's even, blending into a nice mellow sub. A couple little peaks right here where there's some interaction. But the kick especially looks really good with the sub. And the transient impact of the kick and the snare is definitely higher than even where the sub is still interacting a little bit with the body tail of the snare, right? So that's a good setup for hitting a compressor or a limiter. You know, they're going to be triggered only on the transients, not on all this other stuff. But we still have a big problem in that, you know, these summed values for the kick and the snare are way overshooting these white 0 dB FS lines. Like this is just super overshooting everything. So it's a big, huge waveform right now. And so we need to get that under control and get all this stuff back in between the white lines. So what's going on here and how can we fix this? Well, that's all done with clippers, basically to get them back down inside the lines. So if we stop looking at the summed view and we only look at the the main view by itself, you can see the main view, which is again this version that's way over here on my mix bus, my main track that everything's summing to. Here you can see they're all in control. It looks exactly like the summed shape. It's just very much under control. Okay, so here's what it looks like and sounds like. Now you're hearing a little click because I've got one of my duckers it doesn't have any smoothing on it, so you're hearing a little bit of interaction between the snap down of the sub on the ducker. I can fix that. Let's go do that real quick. Let's get ducker. Let's just put smoothing back on again. Okay, so now we don't hear that click anymore. So the point is, an oscilloscope like this really helps you understand what's going on. And I won't slow down this video by talking about the way I've applied clipping to keep all this stuff under control and keep it under zero. That's a whole different subject. But the point is, Psyscope lets you see all this really carefully. Now, there's one other thing Psyscope lets you do. And by the way, I got this interaction between the kick and the sub under control partly by how I set the curve for my ducking. You'll notice this is a very interesting looking curve, but when you work with an oscilloscope, you'll figure out that your typical like sort of J-shaped ducking curve, this kind of curve right here, often doesn't work really well because it'll just let too much of like the sub still interact with the kick while the kick tail is still falling out. And sometimes you have to make these very careful surgical curves to get this kind of smoothness. Look how smooth this kick just blends right into the sub, and there's no interaction and there's no phasing, and it's just solid and smooth feeling, right? Sometimes you have to do shapes like this to pull that off. Here's what my snare ducker looks like on the sub, right? Slightly different shape. To try and minimize these post peaks down here. I couldn't completely get rid of them even with EQ changes, but that's about as good as I could get it. And it's still, the point is to get these down under the level of the transient right here. So this was the shape that let me do that. Okay, so here's the other really, really cool thing that this can tell you. Let's bring up the instrument that the kick is coming from. And let's zoom in really close on this kick here. Yeah, let's go back to just showing our sub. Let's do the layers. Let's turn off the main, turn off the snare. And we're just going to look at the interaction between the kick and the sub. So you can see that when the duck comes in, it's taking this blue line for the sub completely down to nothing during this part where we had all this phase interference. And so by the time the sub starts swelling back up according to that ducking shape that I built here, is it you? Yeah. So as the sub starts coming in right here at this size, it's all in phase now. Right? And so those things dovetail together nicely. Now, check out what happens when, and I'm going to put the stacked, nope, let's try this one more time. Let's bring in this too. So this black line is showing you, again, if I turn these off, this is the total mix bus view. Let's make this a little bigger too. Okay, so this is our nice smooth line. This is the kick. So let's go back and put the sub back on and the kick back on. And so you can see what this black line here is showing us is how the purple kick and the blue sub are summing together here in this part where they're phase coherent, right? And so that's what's making this nice, smooth, unchanging amplitude without any audible dip in the sound. So that's why we don't have the boing, boing, boing. If I turn off the kick ducker, it's going to change, and you're going to see this black line dip down here now. Actually, it's going to get bigger because I'm not ducking. Here's the boing. And here, they're summing together too much because there's no ducking. And so the combined signal makes this big punch that's even as high as the transients, and you can see they're all getting clipped by my clippers. And you don't want this tonal part of the sub getting clipped, right? Maybe the transient of the kick is okay to clip, but not the subby body tone, right? So if we turn the ducker back on and get that under control. Okay, so let's watch what happens when your kick is not phase aligned here in the tail where you're letting those two signals interact anymore. So you can see I've tuned this kick up 4 semitones and then down a little bit in sense. Okay, so if I just take this and drop it down to 0, like I haven't tuned it, watch what happens. Hear that boing again? The boing's back, but it's in a different place. Here's my side chain. The boing, the dropout, is happening here in the tail end of the kick, where it's now completely out of phase with the sub. And so it's causing the black line behind it to just really dip down almost to nothing. And so that's the boing. So how many times in the past have you just thrown a ducker on a sub, listened to it against the kick, set the ducking tail shape to be really long, like this is an 8th note. This shape is happening from here to here is an 8th note. So this entire ducking curve is happening over 1/8 note. But if I were to try and get rid of this without phase aligning my kick and my sub, I'd have to make this duck last a lot longer. And then it would just, again, you're always fighting this trade-off between the phase boing, right, versus what your ducker can control. And sometimes you just can't get it right with a duck. You're just like, wow, I can't get rid of that audible gap, that boing. That's just terrible. And so what you do is you end up like trying to make your duck really long. It still doesn't fix it. So then you try and make your duck really short. Anything to try and get rid of that dropout. And when you make your duck super short, then you're bringing back all the phase interference that's happening in this earlier part, right? And you can't ever get it right. It's like, it seems like no matter how you set your ducker, you can't stop the phase interference and you can't stop that gap in the sub, right? So the point is, you need to do your pitch, your phase alignment, right? And you need to focus on like, okay, I don't want the sub and the kick summing together here because that's going to make my transients really high. And then my final compression and limiter are going to have to squash that way too much, and it's going to take all the life out of my kick and make it soft and rubbery. And it's also going to hurt the impact of my subs, etc. So, you know, you have to do some side chaining in this early part where the kick and the sub interact, but then you have to get where they are still interacting during the swell up after the duck. You have to make sure this part is phase aligned. This purple line and this blue line need to be together in phase. So, you know, that's what you want it looking like over the part where they interact. So hopefully this shows you why using an oscilloscope is super, super helpful. And then I think I've showed you almost everything about Psyscope, except for the fact that you have total control over the line color and the fill color. Like this is a brighter purple line and a darker purple fill, a brighter aqua line and a lighter aqua fill. My summed signals, I do with a dark outline and a fill, right, to show me that's a sum of some sort. And you can control all that, the stroke or the line and the fill for every one of those 8 different channels. And you can also control it for the sum value. Here's the sum stroke and the sum fill. And you have control over, like, you know, the color of your background and your text and all that stuff. And you can make all these settings and then save that to a user preset, right? And then you can always come in like a brand new project and load that user preset and get your colors exactly the way you like it. And then even if you add new instances of Psyscope later and their colors are mismatching because they're not using your preset yet, you can just come to any one of the instances that you've loaded your color preset into and just click this To All button, and it instantly spits all this color definition to the new instance of Psyscope. So this is just incredibly well thought out. It's so useful for this kind of work. You don't have to try and grab and freeze the waveform manually like I had to do in Bitwig all the time. It just like freezes the minute you stop playback, and you can look at everything closely, and it's just wonderful. So if you're on Windows, get this because it's amazing. All right.